call Juliet Ginter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Green Party supported this bill initially at first reading to Select Committee, and we certainly support the direction or intent that it's meant to implement. But unfortunately, during the Select Committee process, which my colleague James Shaw was involved in, there were a number of concerns raised by submitters, and we don't believe the legislation addresses those concerns to such an extent that we can support it at this stage. I have to start probably by saying just how fundamentally important standards are. It's incredibly important that we have a process for setting them that is robust, informed, and absolutely independent. The previous speaker, Honourable Judith Collins, mentioned the leaky buildings fiasco. And of course, the leaky buildings fiasco came about because of changes to the standard that were made by a national government, which I think well, there were changes made by Labour and by National, and it was indeed the Treasury who didn't take the advice of the experts who were sitting in on the meetings and who said that it wasn't government's role to regulate this sort of thing, that the standards of buildings would be sorted out in case law. And that's, I think, the reason why we're quite concerned about this national government introducing this, such a fundamental change to the process for setting standards is because there's been a pattern with this national government of influence by businesses and industry and doing making decisions that make their lives easier in the short term, but ultimately that can end up costing us all in the long term because what's cheaper and better for some players in the short term is not necessarily what's best for everyone, for consumers and for residents here in New Zealand. So it's incredibly important that we have a robust, independent, informed process for setting the standards. This bill is proposing quite a shake-up to the current system, and I'm not arguing that it doesn't need a shake-up, but the main reason for the changes that was listed is that it's not financially sustainable within its current business model and its operating environment. And what has not come through the Select Committee process at all is how this change process is going to solve that problem of financial sustainability. So it's unclear that there's going to be any cost savings. It's possible that they'll be recovering the cost through user charges, so that's just shifting the costs elsewhere, and it's certainly not been demonstrated that that's going to have a better result for the standards setting process. The other two issues that my colleague James Shaw raised, which we're still concerned about, are the fact that it's not going to deal with the issue of parallel processing. That's the ability for the multiple standards to be progressed at the same time. So there's a capacity issue, which is not likely to be solved by the new model. And finally, the perception of independence, which was raised by a number of submitters and is clearly very important to us as a trading nation, that we are perceived to have a robust, independent system for setting standards that can give consumers and other countries confidence in our standard setting process. I'd just like to raise the issue, because obviously we hear a lot from this national government that because we're a trading nation, we have to make it easier to trade, make it easier for businesses to do business. And I'd just like to point out that some of the most successful trading nations on the planet at the moment, have very, very high standards. They have robust processes, and they're quite strict, and yet they manage to be successful manufacturing economies that make their way on exports. And so examples I'm thinking of are like Germany, who has much different approach to their building standards. And as a result, they have healthier buildings, longer lasting buildings, and more energy efficient buildings. And if we are going to tackle the crises of climate change and of inequality, then standards are going to be essential to that, because some of the standards that have been set in the past have actually led us to an outcome where we have less healthy buildings, more energy intensive buildings, and it is through this process of standards that we can start to actually reduce the energy consumption of the economy, to have healthier homes, longer lasting homes, and we need to ensure that we have a good process for setting those standards, and we're not convinced that this bill is making the right changes.